where do we go? Where do we go from here? What is the future of Palestine after all of these sacrifices and all of this devastation?
First and foremost, the lawyers aren't under the illusion that the legal efforts on their own are going to, have the outcome that is needed. We're all engaged in this process of building the pressure and hoping that something at some point will break.
When we're dealing directly and trying to move a specific politician, what motivates them?
Okay, everybody, let's get started. Hi, welcome. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. Welcome to the NYC DSA office. I'm Jeremy, he, him. I am the co-chair emeritus of the New York City DSA and continue to be very involved in our Palestine work, and really so glad to welcome everybody here this evening, both our people here in person and our many attendees via Zoom, and our amazing lineup of speakers. I'm going to hand it to my co-host, my co-moderator for the evening, to kind of kick us off, and hopefully we'll have a really generative discussion for this event, which the title of which is the Ceasefire Movement and Where It's Headed, a chance to come together and reflect. So I'm handing it to Sumaya.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. My name is Sumaya Awad. I am a member of New York City DSA and the Director of Strategy at the Diala Justice Project. Thank you for joining us today. We brought together this powerful panel of speakers to discuss both where we're at in the ceasefire movement and more generally the Palestine movement, and to sort of reflect on what needs to be done. We know that there's this big contradiction in that the movement for ceasefire and the movement for Palestinian liberation is growing. More and more people are joining. We know the majority of Americans support a ceasefire, and yet what Israel is doing in Gaza is just getting worse. The genocide continues to happen. The ethnic cleansing of Palestinians continues to happen. And that's a contradiction that we're grappling with and that we're here today to discuss. And I'm going to introduce our incredible speakers. We have three, one with us in person and two on Zoom. We have Sandra Tamari, who is a Palestinian organizer and the executive director of the Diala Justice Project. She's also the co-founder of the St. Louis Palestine Solidarity Committee. And she is joining us today from St. Louis, Missouri. We have Diala Shamas, who's a senior staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights, joining us from New York City. And we have Beth Miller, who's the political director of Jewish Voice for Peace, and joining us here live.
Thank you, Sumaya. And thank you so much to our panelists. I'm going to start to Sandra on Zoom. And I think we want to pose this question to all three of the panelists, so then people can jump in. But Sandra, if you want to start, we wanted to kick off the event just to think about, in the arc of the movement in the US to promote and to support a ceasefire since October, what have, in your mind, the key developments been? What have we achieved, and what have some of the main obstacles been? When you look at the kind of the arc of the movement so far, how do you assess its key moments?
Thank you, Jeremy. It's really an honor to be here with all of you. Thank you, all of you, for organizing this panel. I have to say that this has been a time when I haven't had a lot of time to reflect, so I appreciate invitations like this that force me to actually write something down and think about where we've been and where we're headed. Prior to October 7th, I think that we announced very, confidently that Palestine had won the left. The coalitions that were out there, reflected a very, broad coalition of people fighting for social justice, and Palestine was not excluded from that left movement. And now, we're expanding. Obviously, it's no longer just an issue of the left. You're seeing all kinds of groups coming out for ceasefire: artists for ceasefire, moms for ceasefire, potters for ceasefire, that my daughter is involved in. And the list goes on. And you see city resolutions coming out, more than 70 cities voting for ceasefire. And a broad swath of the Democratic base wants ceasefire. You see dissent coming from congressional staffers, White House and State Department staffers, and even staffers at the Democratic National Committee expressing dissent over the Biden administration's, continued support for the genocide in Gaza. And a few have resigned. And the coalitions that we've built over the last decade are holding. and growing. The relationships that we hold with racial justice groups like Movement for Black Lives, that continues to grow and has not wavered in this moment of crisis. I'm on this panel with Beth Miller. Jewish Voice for Peace did not, hesitate to stand in full solidarity with Palestine in this moment. The pressure could have taken them in a different path, but the work that we've done and the relationships we've built over the last decade made that, that determination, that position very strong for them. And we're continuing to fight for a new future. I mean, the hesitation I have in celebrating all of this is that, of course, we're talking about ceasefire, which is a demand that none of us imagined would be the one that we would be focusing on. And so the question now is, will this translate into a movement for Palestinian freedom? Will this become a movement? All of these new people that are coming out on the streets, all of these people that are fighting for city resolutions, will they continue to fight for Palestinian liberation the day after ceasefire? That's not a guarantee. And that's on us, all of us as the left, to continue to build out, to welcome new people to our movement, and to build the campaigns that excite and have meaning. Right now we're in an election year, as we all know. That's going to distract us from the devastation that's happening in Gaza. And then where do we go? Where do we go from here? It's really hard to think about, because we're talking about, what is the future of Palestine? And after all of these sacrifices and all of this devastation, and how do we put an end to finally ending this siege on Gaza, ending the U.S.'s unwavering support for Israel and its genocidal policies? Palestinians are showing us again how to shake off the chains of occupation and shake off the siege. But are we getting to a place where we can see a path of new politics? I hope that we're on a path to a different world. This moment really has exposed a lot of truths, the truths of our rotten two-party system, the truth that liberalism upholds Zionism and upholds genocide, that a rich country like the US will continue to starve and unhouse the poor to buy more weapons for violence and death, and a Democratic Party that now is ready to sell away the rights of immigrants and asylees, the one position that they said differentiated them from the Trumpians, willing to sell away those rights in support of Israel, in order to get the funding that they want for Israel for more weapons and more devastation. And so I am thinking, what is the point of all this pain unless we're on a new path? And it really is incumbent upon us to be building that path and building out a left that's very appealing to the majority of people. And I'll leave it there and look forward to the conversation.
Really brilliantly put. Diala, do you want to jump in on this initial question of kind of your picture of this arc of the movement?
Yeah, absolutely. Although I don't really dare follow Sandra in kind of analysis on where the movement is at. I think I was sort of hoping to share a little bit about where we're seeing, from my vantage point. So I'm an attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights. I'm also Palestinian, and we're trying to think through, I'm just reflecting on what the legal trajectory has looked like and how it actually reflects a lot of what Sandra was also sharing. And in preparation for this, Sumaya asked me to share a little bit about our case and where that's at. So I can just share a little bit on that. Early on when the assault on Gaza started, I think there was a lot of, it became very clear that this moment was different and that it was going to require wildly different kind of strategies and language, and that similarly legally, we will need to be thinking differently. And it also became very clear that the assault would be unprecedented and that it looked like Israel was, engaging in genocidal acts. And so we called it that pretty early. And unfortunately, that's kind of now something that is widely recognized and accepted. And we filed litigation here in U.S. federal court. They're claiming, sorry, there's a dog here, focusing on not only what Israel is doing, but here from the vantage point of the United States, U.S. complicity in what Israel is doing. And so we sued President Biden, Blinken, Secretary of State Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Austin for complicity in genocide, as well as failure in their duty to prevent genocide. So two claims under international law, which is recognized under federal law. And there is also, of course, people probably are familiar with that international level. At the international level, the International Court of Justice, South Africa, brought those claims, a genocide claim against Israel. But it was important for us also, although we actually filed this case before the South Africa case, to be focusing on the U.S. complicity angle, right? The U.S. government is the biggest military, financial, diplomatic supporter of Israel. It has been unwavering, as Sandra put it, in its support, rushing more weapons, and so on and so forth. So the litigation, which we brought in federal court, had this kind of incredible hearing in Oakland last week, Friday. So the 26th, January 26th. And I think in many ways, our clients, the Palestinians who are plaintiffs, did in that moment, in that microcosm of a federal courthouse, what Palestinians have been doing for the past 17 weeks, right? So despite the tremendous amount of pain, tremendous amount of loss, despite all odds, still testified in court, told their truth. And from a litigator's perspective, kind of remarkable, probably the first time in U.S. federal court where you heard Palestinian perspectives, spoke about the Nakba, the displacement of their families in 1948, and why that is relevant for the court to understand the injury and the harm they're experiencing now. The hearing had massive amounts of incredible movement organizers outside the courthouse there in support of the Palestinian plaintiffs, but also, calling out the defendants, the administration officials that were suing. And we got a really interesting opinion just 3 days later. So the judge issued an opinion after this historic hearing where he heard Palestinians, and at the end of the hearing, he described it as gut-wrenching and that the most difficult, factually difficult case in his career. So although he declined to sort of extend the relief that we asked for, and the relief that we had asked for was that he issue an injunction prohibiting further U.S. support to Israel's assault, and we also asked him to declare that U.S. that support is unlawful. He also he declined to sort of issue that immediate relief, but the opinion is remarkable because he basically said, he quoted the International Court of Justice opinion, said that it is plausible that there is an unfolding genocide here. And I quote, "It is every individual's obligation to confront the current siege in Gaza." And yes, I said he just described U.S. He described basically the allegations of the credible testimony and all of the record that they basically said looks like a genocide to me, which I think as we talk about what next, is something that feels very significant, is something that we that people have already been using and taking to different interlocutors. And now not only do we have the World's Court, the International Court of Justice, that has found plausibility of a case of genocide here, but also we have a U.S. federal court that's looked at this through the lens of U.S. officials' obligations. So I think that to me remains the relief that we're seeking through the court remains to be the primary demand, outside of the court too. So an end to U.S. support, to military, diplomatic, political, all forms of support to this assault, and I think more broadly. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, if Diala felt like she couldn't follow Sandra, the idea that I could follow Sandra and Diala is kind of a joke. But I think that what I will do is try to focus in a little bit on the area that I work in specifically, which is the movement's kind of arc and what we're seeing in terms of how it's impacting Congress specifically. And I think it's an area where we often find, I think, on the left that we have to bump up against the like hard realities of the growing power of our movement and like people power and the ways that we are growing so rapidly and bringing people with us up against the like the hard truths of the current limits to our governing power, right? And that's a hard tension to hold when we are organizers and activists who are out there shutting down bridges, shutting down roads, protesting in our members of Congress's office, driving millions of calls literally and taking historic amounts of mass action, and then still seeing that at the end of the day, the US government continues to be not just complicit and actively cheering on a genocide against Palestinians right now. And that's a really hard thing for all of us to hold. And within it, I have seen from my vantage point as someone who is kind of trying to hold the, like taking what the movement demands are and literally saying them to members of Congress and trying to build movement there. What I can see is that there are undeniable and historic cracks forming in what was once a unquestioned bipartisan consensus around you just don't ask questions, you just support the Israeli government. And that's your path of least resistance as a politician, basically. You just go for it. Don't worry about it. Just do it. That is no longer the case. And that alone is new. That alone is new. The idea that politicians would feel that this is a question they have to reckon with is development. It's pathetic development in terms of what it means for where the US government has been for decades. It's also because of the work of the movement to do all this and get us there. And it leads then in and directly connects to what Sandra and Diala were mentioning, right? It's because of those cracks are both the result of and then deepened by the movement, right? So you have all these protests shutting down Cannon House Rotunda, taking the National Mall, marching along in DC, taking landmarks across the country. That sparks things like congressional staffers then feeling empowered to do a walkout. That sparks State Department officials feeling like they can speak out and they can resign. And it tells a narrative nationally that DC is out of touch with its voters on the question of Palestine. That is also a development. For those of us who've been deep in it, it's not a shocking development. I think we've known it for a long time, but in terms of a national narrative that is like starting to be told, that is new. And it's part of the result of the ways in which the movement has been, like Sandra said, expanding and bringing in new people who maybe before either didn't know a lot about what was happening in Palestine, or they knew, but they didn't feel activated to do something about it. Those people are now in the I should do something about it mode. And that can range in actions from picking up their phone and calling their member of Congress to being arrested at a protest and everything in between, which contains a lot of like the in between is huge within that. And so I think that what we're seeing is that these cracks that are forming are deepening quickly and they are growing, right? It's kind of like, I sometimes imagine this as like, you make these little cracks in like stone or in glass or something, and it feels like you're not maybe making much of an impact. But then if you have enough cracks at some point, one tiny little is just going to shatter the whole thing. And so this is about building up those cracks over and over and over again. And the thing that I think feels really important to me for all of us who are doing this work day in and day out to remember is that even when we feel like it's not making a difference, even when we do these things and then we see that Antony Blinken has once again fucking said some shit, And you're like, did this even matter? The fact that I just spent months throwing my life into the thing to remember is that, yes, it does. And just because we haven't changed necessarily what the Biden administration is publicly doing, like that's the last one to fall. That's the last part that's going to move on this. And everything else is going to move before that. The tactics that the movement have been employing work. Members of Congress have moved on this issue. City councilors have moved. State legislative officials have moved. Institutions have moved. You have probably brought in family members and community members. You've grown the movement. And those things all mean that every time we come back again and again and again to talk to our elected officials about this, we're coming back with more and more power, and those cracks are getting deeper. And it means that we just need to dive deeper into the tactics, not feel that they are not working immediately enough. We just need to do them more and bigger and with more and more people every time.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Diala and Sandra. So many different directions to go in. I think one thing that's clear from all three of you is that Palestine is reshaping not just the left in the US, but Palestine is reshaping in general US politics. It's not a fringe issue anymore. It's something that everyone running for office has to think about. It's something that labor unions are being forced to think about. It's really reshaped the terrain in US politics. I want to take us back to Diala for a moment to talk about the lawsuits. The lawsuits were obviously incredibly important and unprecedented in a number of ways that you mentioned, Diala. And we're complementing all the street action and the various tactics that have been used, not just in the US, but around the world, that sort of forced these lawsuits into the courts, and then also the decisions on them and the way that the judges responded to them, whether it's the ICJ or here in the US federal court. Can you talk a little bit about, well, two things. The first is that I think one of the powerful things about the US court, and Diala, maybe you can talk about this a bit more, is it was also showing Biden, like, even in the courts that you believe in, which we know have limitations, which we weren't expecting very much from, but even in these courts, you are being held accountable. And even in these courts, we are telling you are complicit. And in this case, the judge basically agreed. But then there's the question of, like, what next on the legal front, Diala, in both the ICJ case, but also in the US specifically. What is the next step on that front?
Yeah, thanks. So it was really important to have something in a US federal court and to be getting at this question of US complicity and unquestioning, unflagging support, that word is the word the judge used, and to force them to answer, to force them to get their lawyers to write the briefs, to try to get out of it, to invoke the various exceptions to judicial review that they ultimately invoked, something called the political question doctrine. Essentially, the position that the Biden administration's lawyers are taking, which is that even if, taken to its logical extreme, we're committing genocide, courts can't do anything, right? So it's some real separation of powers, concerns, and questions. And so we're certainly looking to push and challenge that wrong interpretation of the scope of judicial review. But this, like all things, is one, and I really like the image of the glass shattering that Beth put forward. Like, that's absolutely how I see it. The language that we're able to get in this decision is picked up by, protesters outside of Blinken's house. I saw, reading that back to them. We are seeing State Department spokesperson Miller being questioned about the ICJ as well as the, federal court judges' language. We know that it's showing up already, and this is only a couple of days after the decision was issued, in letters that people are writing internally and trying to move things, on the inside. And all of this just adds on to the already large pile of forceful evidence and, language that people can draw on as they engage in action on all sorts of fronts. So, in terms of other, like, what the legal landscape looks like, I think that this is going to be sort of redefining a lot of how international human rights litigation looks like for the next who knows how long. I mean, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice's proceedings brought by South Africa are momentous. Of course, many of us wish that the court would have just issued the ceasefire, which was South Africa demand, the provisional measure that would have required a ceasefire, but actually the provisional measures that the International Court of Justice did issue are really significant and essentially require, a cessation of the military assault, but also have implications for third states. And like what everybody, now that we have this provisional order, these provisional measures do, like what other states do in response to that is something we're all going to be looking to. So the action isn't over at the international level. It's just begun. Of course, the next phase of the ICJ proceedings will be sort of on the merits, but even before then, Israel's required to submit sort of 30 days after the order came down. So I don't know how many days that is from now, to file something, and then South Africa will have its submission. So we'll have these additional moments of contestation and forcing articulations of like what is going on here at the international level, and then how that interplays in other countries too. I think we're going to be seeing litigation in other third states. I think people are very interested in looking at companies and weapons manufacturers and like everywhere. Like once you have these orders that basically say that a genocide is likely unfolding, then there's something called a duty to prevent, and you have to do everything within your power to not further it, and that includes not selling weapons. That also includes not whether you're private corporation or a government. So I think we're going to be seeing a lot of that, but I think none of us are under the illusion. First and foremost, the lawyers aren't under the illusion that the legal efforts on their own are going to have the outcome that is needed. We're all engaged in this process of building the pressure and hoping that something at some point will break. And that is, I think just back to Sandra's opening words, just to get that bare minimum, we're talking about a ceasefire now. We're talking about ending the killing and ending the mass death. I think for me, the interesting question is like, how do we also while we're also engaging in that kind of emergency intervention work, how are we building the narrative? How are we building the institutions to ensure that the day after, whenever that might come, we're not back to square one and we're not still talking about the same things that we were talking about before that ended up getting us in the situation in the first place. So I think that's just to bring it back. I think that's what's so significant about things like Palestinian, our plaintiffs choosing to talk about the Nakba and not just starting to talk about, as a way of understanding how the families got here in the first place and how it's impacting them in the first place. I think it's also a question of contesting U.S. Israel, unshakable relationships and hegemony in these institutions. And I think all of that is being questioned right now through these legal proceedings and in how they're interacting with what everybody is doing.
Thank you, Diala. I want to take those questions that you posed at the end and reform them to ask you a question, Sandra. A big question. What are the groups, not necessarily organizations, but could also be organizations, but what are the groups that we need to be thinking about and focusing on that still need to be shifted and who have the social power and the political power to push this needle even further, not just on ceasefire, but on some of the larger questions as well that you all have mentioned today and that many of us have been talking about in the movement about ending U.S. funding to Israel?
Yeah, thanks, Samaya. Well, I'm thinking a little bit backwards. I'm thinking about the tactics that are available to us. I mean, we all are familiar with the BDS movement, and I think that we've underutilized divestment. We know about divestment on, at least divestment resolutions being passed by universities across the country, but very little divestment has actually happened. And so I'm thinking about, what are the organizations that have investments that they could like look at, decide that these companies, there are lots of tools that will provide people with, the list of companies that are complicit in the Israeli oppression of Palestinians. And, the first group that comes to mind, of course, is labor unions. Labor unions, big ones, have considerable assets that they invest for the benefit of their members. And, I know that there have been efforts to, begin to investigate where pension funds and where union finances are invested, and how great would it be to have a very, major divestment of SEIUs, for instance, union divesting from Israel. We, also thinking about Israeli bonds, so many places invested in Israeli bonds, including in unions. Could they, pull back? And the other big group that I've been thinking about, and maybe is not something that this group thinks about a lot, but I do think about the church. I think about especially the Black church that is, feeling contradictions, about the current moment. We've seen how the radical Black clergy have really been pushing the Biden administration. They've been basically telling Biden, don't expect us to get out the vote this year. How can we encourage people to vote for someone who is supporting this kind of violence, this kind of carnage? But I think that hasn't reached the pews just yet. We still have a lot of confusion. Christian Zionism is a bigger problem than Jewish Zionism, to be honest. And how do we deal with those who are reachable in the pews? We haven't done a lot of good outreach, and I think that we have opportunities to begin to think with those people about how to disengage whatever biblical ideas people might have about Israel from the modern day apartheid genocide state.
I think, yeah, I totally agree, Sandra, that like the Black pastor's letter is maybe just like of incredible political significance, and really in an election year, no less. I think really, really important for us to understand, and for the left to think really hard about how to build with. I also wanted to say just briefly to Diala, I think we shouldn't underestimate also how much long-term importance legal cases like this have, because I think for people who are not on the left, and for people who are like looking to understand the society, like they receive a ton of mainstream propaganda, but they also, I think, like successful cases like the one you've pursued, allow people to feel the sort of weight and authority of like moral sources like the law, that whatever, we're Marxists, it's complicated, but like Marx did ideology critique, or I'm a Marxist, I don't want to speak for everyone, but Marx did ideology critique, and I think the idea was like, you take ideals that people believe in, you take the ideals that they say they stand for, justice, law, truth, etc., and you show how their actual practices are not in line with those. And that's a very powerful way for a lot of people who believe in those ideas to come to your movement, because you're not saying, give up your whole framework, law is a tool of the bourgeois state, etc. You're saying like, law there are ideals behind it, and we can show systematically how those ideals are violated. So I think like there's huge public value to that kind of work. I wanted to turn really to Beth for a question. Anyone's welcome to jump in too, on I think what you said really nicely about learning the limits, or the contradictions between the movement power and its growth, and the limits of our governing power. I'm curious if you have reflections on like kind of what we've learned too from, the ceasefire group of legislators continues to grow. That said, it's not growing as fast as we want. It's not the majority that we want. So what have we learned about like where sort of which Congress people, which parts of the political infrastructure have been, as it were, penetrable to our demand? Like what have we learned about like their characteristics, like, and what have we learned too about the those who have not, and why they might not be, in a way that maybe orients us towards how do we build the power we need to get past those obstacles?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one thing that's really interesting about so right now we're at, I believe 65 or 66 members of Congress in the House of Representatives and in the Senate who've called for a ceasefire as defined by the majority of groups doing this kind of advocacy work and movement work. And I think one thing that's kind of fascinating about them is that they are not all the same. Like, it's not like, oh, it's all the progressives. That's like very much not the case. It's been a bit strange to see who pops off when and how and where in a way that has been kind of humbling for me. I think I was like, I know who's going to say what, when, and how. And then I was like, oh, wow, this was really surprising. Like, and I think it speaks to the fact that to your question, Jeremy, different tactics reach different members of Congress, reach different politicians in different ways. And it's an important thing for us to remember as organizers, as activists, that when we're dealing directly and like trying to move a specific politician, and I would just like to say that Diala, you said something that resonated for me in my work, which is like, the legal efforts on their own won't do this. I feel quite similarly about like congressional advocacy on its own won't do this, right? Like, it has to be all of it together. There has to be a big diversity of movement tactics and targets and how we do this. Having said that, within that, for those of us who are trying to do the work of like, I have a very specific member of Congress, I have these senators, and I'm trying to move them, we can't actually copy paste tactics. We can learn from each other, and we should learn from each other. And also we should remember that we need to like know who our political organizing targets are, right? So like if we are trying to move a very specific member of Congress, those of us leading that work should know who that person is, which is not a given. Like we don't always think that way, understandably, but it's important for us to think like, what motivates them in general and on this issue? Is it a re-election year for them? Do they care about other foreign policy issues? Do they not care at all about foreign policy, but they care a ton about housing? Do they not care at all about housing, but they care a lot about women's rights? What are the groups that they listen to? Who are the people that they want close to them and surrounding them? Who do they think are their people? And are their people gettable for us? How do they respond to protests? Some members of Congress, honestly and truly, will move in the other direction if you protest them. They will move away from you if you protest them. Some of them, if you protest them, will buckle and come toward you and do what you want them to do. Can you do research onto your member of Congress? How do they respond to different tactics? Will it bring you closer to them? All of those things are good things to research and think about. And then there are other parts of it that are just kind of, for some of them, for some of the people who've moved on this issue, I believe that it has been an ideological stance for them. For some of them, right? It has been that they have seen what is going on, they believe it is horrible, and they believe it needs to stop, and so they have spoken out and they have taken this stance. For others of them, I think for the majority of them, it has been a political calculus decision that they have made. They have decided that for them, it is politically wiser for them to call for a ceasefire. And there's many reasons to that. It could be that they're in a district where their constituency is overwhelmingly progressive and calling for this. It could be that, they've got like political ambitions down the line and they're reading some sort of like tea leaves and they think that this is going to look good for them a year from now. It could be that it's about how they want to relate to Biden, right? Like Dean Phillips from Minnesota was one of the earlier members to call for a ceasefire. He wrote it in a horrible way. His statement was just crap, racist, horrible statement, but he called for a ceasefire. I think that's because he wants to primary Biden. So he wanted to have a marker that was different from Biden. So there's many different reasons within this why people move. There are categories of it, right? Like for some people, for some electeds, if you are like going in and sitting down with them and having meetings and you're telling them stories, Palestinians are meeting with them, they're hearing perspectives they've never heard before, that will move some politicians who are ideologically moved on this issue. There are other politicians who you could do that with for years and they would never budge as long as they think that the easiest way for them to get reelected is for them to like support the Israeli government, support Biden. So again, it's about kind of like knowing who they are. I do think that one of the through lines across the board, though, goes back to what we were talking about before, which is the ways in which this moment of kind of the push for a ceasefire, which again, as we've said before, is not the same as the push for Palestinian liberation, right? This is the time-sensitive, urgent demand that needs to happen right now to stop an unfolding genocide, and it needs to build out into something bigger. But the one through line for all these members of Congress, I think, has been that they have all seen that more people than they thought wanted this, right? That like, oh, it's not just the people I assumed. There's like other groups that are calling for a ceasefire. There's other parts of my constituency that are coming to me with this. There are other, it's kind of like, it's almost like we've shrunk the political space around them, right? And I think that it's been an interesting lesson to be in and see that, you know, we often think of escalation as like a bigger protest, a more escalated protest. And that is a very strong path of escalation that is sometimes like very warranted and perfect. And also, even if it doesn't move the member of Congress, it can tell a media story. There's a million reasons why that's like a great path. It's also true that another path of escalation is finding ways to pull away their allies or the people they thought were their allies. That's also political escalation. So for a lot of members of Congress who haven't yet called for a ceasefire, I would say probably for most of them, except for some who are very ideologically Zionist and like will always support Israel because it is what they genuinely, honestly believe to be right. Like they are the inverse of us on that, right? Like they're taking an ideological stance for them. For everyone in the middle, if they haven't called for a ceasefire yet, it's probably because they have decided that like the water around them has gotten very hot and they've decided that they can live at that temperature. Like you've protested them over and over again. You've done these things over and over again. And they've just decided like, this is uncomfortable, but like, I can live with this. Like, it doesn't matter. This is okay. So for people like that, one of the ways to keep escalating is to then think, okay, so how do we make it not tenable for them? How do we make it so that it's not okay for them? So if they're okay with the fact that Palestinians and progressive Jews and the movement for Black Lives and human rights organizations, all these people are like protesting and da-da-da. If they're like, that's fine, then we need to bring in more people for them. So then who are the groups in their district, in their state, where they are like, if I lose their support, it's unacceptable to me. I cannot lose this other group. So then it's an organizing finding of like, how do we get in there? How do we move them? How do we get those people? And that's also a path of escalation. And I think that showing the diversity of the movement, the constituents, the people that have been demanding the ceasefire has been a through line for all the members of Congress that have then come out, no matter the kind of other reasons behind it as well for them.
I think one question that pops up a lot still, surprisingly, but I think is probably an important one, is why is Palestine, why is Gaza so taboo? And it seems like a very simple question with like, I'm sure you all have answers ready to go, but I think it would actually be useful to have that laid out. Like, here's why people still haven't come out for a ceasefire, whether it's in Congress, and maybe that has to do with AIPAC. Beth, if you could talk about AIPAC a bit, but also like in the social movement space, when we think of like people that deem themselves progressives or organizations or labor unions that took a while to come out or ones that haven't yet. And I'm curious what our panelists would answer to that question. And maybe we can start with you, Sandra.
Oh, good question, Samaya. There are many ways to tackle this, but I think that the way I want to tackle it is that Gaza is the impediment to the liberal facade of Israel. Gaza exists as a colonial prison to cordon off the unwanted natives, and to give Israel this demographic majority that allows them to project this liberal, democratic, progressive facade to the world. You know, why are the people of Gaza, why are the Palestinians of Gaza, there? They're there because they're the unwanted, and because they threaten that liberalism. They threaten that notion of democracy. And so I think this is what really gets to the core of like why Gaza exists. It's the reason why there is a Gaza Strip, because it's important to remember Gaza Strip is also a colonial fabrication. Gaza is a province, part of Palestine, a very important educational and cultural and economic province of Palestine historically, that is now just a fraction of what it used to be. And all of these places that, we hear about in the news where all these settlers have, fled from now, or, all of that is also part of Gaza. And so I think that, if we want to like look back at the roots of this, I think that Gaza really just is the threat to this liberal facade. And I believe that's why Gaza has, perplexed social movements for so long.
It's a very good question. I'd be remiss to not sort of name a really powerful elephant in the room when it comes to talking about Palestinians and Gaza is, the T word, terrorism, and how the US and Israel through, conversation with each other at the global scale over the last 20 years have created a very, very powerful narrative where if you sort of, successfully attach the label of terrorism to an actor, whether it's an entire population or their political leadership or some individuals, you can completely isolate them and can do whatever you want to them and can evade the law, can also invade, but evade responsibility, accountability, and act with total impunity. And I think that is something that the world has allowed to happen with regards to Palestinians, who are the sort of prototypical terrorists in the American mind. And so, a lot of the work that I do is defending Palestinian organizations and individuals who sort of encounter this label and accusation through the courts and through the state. So I'm, particularly attuned to it, but I do think that it's playing like a narrative and discursive role in this moment. And then I think the other reason why it's so taboo is and then this is a sort of flip side of that coin, the sort of effective dehumanization of Palestinians, and the fact that there have been no political consequences really for, no significant political consequences for ignoring Palestinian life and demands for Palestinian freedom. And so I think that's very slowly changing, but I do think that it's a question of just extracting political consequences. And I wanted to say a last thing. I think that your question of, like you said, why is it taboo? And ultimately, the in American politics, it's taboo, and why you can't really break into the sort of mainstream around Gaza in particular, as opposed to Palestinians as a whole, is I think of the entrenchment of this narrative of a two-state solution as the only acceptable thing, and Gaza shatters that. What to do with Gaza, right? And nobody wants to talk about it. Like, what is your vision for the Palestinians in Gaza? And there hasn't been an effective articulation of that, even within like the sort of halls of power, right? So I think because it breaks down, it makes it impossible, and it sort of seems so untenable for not just Democrats, but the sort of mainstream to talk about a two-state solution and also talk about Gaza in a coherent way. I think it is therefore taboo.
Yeah, I really echo what Sandra and Diala both said. I think so. In addition to that, from the political angle, why it's like a taboo, it's third rail, like of the kind of talk about any of this is, there are major anti-Palestinian lobby groups that are very active in DC and across the political, in DC and around the country. It is not the be all end all of why this is taboo. It's deeply, deeply tied into everything we just heard about from Diala and Sandra. And so this is adding in, but groups like AIPAC, the Democratic Majority for Israel, Christians United for Israel, Sandra mentioned Christian Zionism, which we should all be talking about much more. Those groups are so active on the Hill. Like, for every call we're driving, they are driving calls as well. They are donating money. They are, in November alone, I'm actually not going to remember the number now. But AIPAC, Democratic Majority for Israel, all these groups are are really in the weeds of working to develop deep relationship with and sway over politicians. And that's because they're lobby groups. That's what lobby groups do, to be clear, right? They're not unique. This is because of our broken political system. We have a broken political system where massive lobby groups have overwhelming sway on a range of issues. Part of the reason our country is so broken. And one of those issues is on Palestine and our relationship to the Israeli government. And it can't be overstated that, again, when we talk about before the divide between what the mass number of voters want, and kind of 80% of Democratic voters want a ceasefire, but only 65 members of Congress have called for a ceasefire. Like, that's a weird break. Why is that? Let's talk about AIPAC. Let's talk about Kufi. Let's talk about the Democratic Majority for Israel. Let's talk about all these other groups. And I think that there are groups that are actively working to ensure that there is ongoing U.S. complicity in Israeli apartheid. And this is important too, is that it's also in our government's interests to deepen these relationships, right? Like, we should remember that the U.S. is not doing any of this out of the good of its heart for anyone, right? We have interests here. For all the money we send, that money is then invested back in our weapons industry. We have regional interests in the Middle East, and it matters to us that we have Israel as a political ally for all those reasons. And those two things combined are a deadly combination for Palestinians that lead to this kind of massive institutional support for the Israeli government that then has this kind of fake moral cover that is often given by our politicians, that they are doing this because they care about Jews, which is better to say than I'm doing it because I want Lockheed Martin to have a good year, right? But it has nothing to do with Jewish safety. That's fake. That's not real. That's not why any of them are doing it. It's not why our government is investing in Israel. It's barely why AIPAC cares about Israel. There are other things. There's like these kind of other military industrial complex that's at play here. And so those things all have to kind of be reckoned with and broken apart when we're talking about this too.
Thank you, Beth. Yeah, just to reiterate and underline 100 times what Beth just said, which is that Israel does not make Jews safe or safer in any way. In fact, it just makes the whole world a lot more dangerous. We're going to move to Q&A. And as we begin to do that, I want to remind people that this is not just a political education event. The point of this is to get people to organize, to be on the streets, to get plugged in, to call your members of Congress, to be activated in any way, and reactivated if you've already been doing this for months. And so we're going to drop some links in the chat. JVP's call to action to call your member of Congress. Do that every day. Take action. And also, this is a DSA sponsored event, and New York City DSA is involved in a number of actions, both in the streets as well as phone banks, organizing to pressure Congress. So if you are not a member of DSA, you can join the New York City DSA chapter, which is an incredible chapter. So there's also a link in there, and Jeremy can talk about that more in a bit. But I want to move us to Q&A. And we'll start with folks here in the room, and then we'll move to some of the questions from Zoom. So I saw a lot of hands go up earlier. Go ahead.
I'll just really quick summarize for the questions for people with Zoom while our panelists think of answers to these many-sided questions. First of all, there was a question about reiterating Christian Zionists and their importance, and then question of cultural resistance, cultural figures coming out for a ceasefire and the importance of that. Second question was on the danger of dwindling interest in the movement because of all that other people have on the table, such as their own bread and butter issues and an electoral cycle. And how do we reach regular people and intervene in an electoral cycle? And the third was America and Israel, who's the dog, who's the tail, who's wagging whom?
Yes, maybe I'll start with the easiest one. Thanks for mentioning cultural campaigns. That's something that Diala Justice Project has been doing for some time. Our big win earlier in 2023, before everything broke loose, was to get Sam Smith to cancel their appearance in Israel. That was, built through relationships, people really talking to them and really convincing them that was going to be a detriment. And I'm sure they're thanking their stars that they made that decision now. And yeah, so we're thinking about who are the other targets. We're building power. Last Saturday? On Saturday, there was a disruption of the Human Rights Campaign gala that some of our team participated in. Human Rights Campaign being the largest LGBTQ advocacy rights organization in the country. Putting on this very fancy gala with A-list stars coming through. Meanwhile, taking very large grants from weapons manufacturers, including Northrop Grumman. So, thousands of people outside protesting, people inside disrupting, and some people turned around and left. I think it's really heartening to see, that kind of action with, India Moore and Sarah Ramirez, out there protesting with our movement, bringing some star power to this. I think that's only going to grow as people feel like it's a safer space to occupy.
Beth, go for it. I'm like, I have nothing to say about celebrities.
Yeah. I wish I was cool enough to be doing culture resistance organizing, but I'm not, so it's not what I'm doing. There's a lot. I'm trying to think about which one to start with. I think I'll actually start with the dog tail, who's wagging who question. I think the truth is that there's no simple, ultimately the US is more powerful, right? Like, we shouldn't get it twisted here. The US is like a global superpower, has been for a very long time, was formative in the creation of the Israeli state, is the largest military funder to the Israeli government. I think it's important that we keep those things lined up. It's also true that the Israeli government and its actions are like deeply entwined with the U.S. politics and the ways it plays out domestically too. So I don't think that it's always that the U.S. tells Israel what to do, or it's always that Israel tells the U.S. what to do, right? Like, it doesn't actually kind of fly that way. And at this point, there's such a deep intertwining of the economic, military, cultural, financial relationships between our two countries that we're deeply in the weeds of like government investment in what the other is doing. And I think that plays out in many, many different ways. But the reason I wanted to take this particular question was that I think that, because you asked, the final piece of what you asked was, how does it inform what we then do? And I think that, I'll speak for JVP specifically, but I think it's true for many, many groups. One thing that's very important for us, and that kind of is a filter for everything we try to think about what we do and how we do it, is like, who are we? Where are we? Who do we have influence over? Like, what's our sphere of influence? And the truth is that an American Jewish organization does not have a direct influential relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu. But we do have direct relationships and influence over like our own domestic Jewish institutions and cultural spaces and religious and spiritual spaces and families and communities. And we do have direct relationship and influence over the people who we elect to represent us as Americans. And so that's why we focus on the US government specifically, because that is always the place where like we have the most obligation, responsibility, and influence. That's who we can actually kind of push at. And I think that the ceasefire theory of change is kind of an example of that, where we have, ultimately Biden doesn't decide if there's a ceasefire, right? Like, we should remember that too. He's got major sway over it and influence over the decision and how it gets made, but it's not actually him that like makes the final call, right? But because we know that like the Israeli government is influenced by him, and he is influenced by his political surroundings, and we have influence over his political surroundings, that is where we enter in, right? And that is where we try to make change. And so I think that it's good for us to always think about, like, in any given, at the individual level, at the communal level, at the geographic level, whatever it may be, what are the institutional spaces around us where we have the most power to create immediate change in a way that could have those domino effects.
I just wanted to come in with two quick things. I mean, Diala, did you have anything you wanted to jump in?
I was just going to say really quickly that
Yeah, go for it.
Agreeing on the tail wagging question, just to underscore how central the U.S. government is to what is currently happening in Gaza, and from a very, very technical, practical perspective, we know that the Israelis do not have enough weapons and enough bombs to drop on Gaza unless we give them to them, unless we rush them to them. And that's absolutely what our big part of our theory of in our legal case rests on. It's also been acknowledged by the Americans and by the Israelis. So huge amount of influence, the ability to, with a phone call, frankly, change the course, and as they have in the past, change the course of Israeli actions on the ground. And I think it's important to keep sort of hammering that point home to everyone we speak to.
Yeah, and I think just one thing I've heard throughout this whole panel is part of our role and part of the work we have to come is to make the connections between an undemocratic American state on so many issues, on housing, on healthcare, on so many things Americans want, and an undemocratic American state on imperialism and on dropping bombs on Gazans. We have to make the connections between getting involved in a movement, that's about a bread and butter issue around your block and fighting for justice and peace on the world scale and vice versa. Like, I think that's some of our work. So I guess, again, that's my little plug for joining DSA and for joining organizations generally, like getting organized, because I think the most important thing about a movement moment is that the people form connections that last beyond any particular set of demands. They become part of a movement to change society over the broader term. And just one little anecdote to that, and goes to Sandra's point on cultural resistance too. Cynthia Nixon, people might know, ran for governor, is a New York City DSA member, is a TV star, a movie star, and was on hunger strike with Sumaya in Washington, D.C. And for Gaza, went on The View and talked about Gaza and Gazans. These are, and part of, and she is part of this movement, and she's raising money for Jamal Bowman to defend him against AIPAC. Making those connections between every sphere of society, our political, our economic, our social, our cultural, etc., is what we all have to do together coming out of this.
So a couple of questions. There's a lot of Zoom questions, so I'm just naming a couple that we've got. Is if someone can break down the perception that progressives have abandoned Jews. And another one, a number of labor unions took stand early on for ceasefire, and how can we work with these unions to deepen our movement to create a real alternative political pole? And then I'm just looking through these, sorry. And then I think maybe actually we'll leave it at that and see if.
Yeah, just the other question that was asked was about kind of the role of a specific way of talking about and remembering the Holocaust and the way that's used to justify Israel's political behavior as part of what makes it taboo and difficult to talk about in the U.S.
I mean, I'll take the easy one. Labor. Are you a member of a labor union? Organize. Are you able to contact members of a labor union? Organize. One very small example is our work with the Progressive Workers Union that represents workers at Sierra Club, 350.org, Greenpeace, and a few other small environmental orgs. Started with Sierra Club workers being really mad about Sierra Club, continuing on with these nature outings to Israel. And then organizing a Palestine caucus to push back and ending and being able to then pass a very strong resolution across the union units not only talking about, not about ceasefire, really talking about full liberation and talking about divestment of their funds from Israeli apartheid. So definitely there are possibilities. You can start small, and we're here to support you.
Diala, do you want to add anything?
Now go for it, Beth.
Yeah, these are great questions, and I'm glad that we get. I think that the ways that we remember the Holocaust and the question of the narrative that's being told around the relationship between like the progressive movement right now and like the Jewish community, I think these are a huge part of the conversation right now. And I'll start with kind of the question around the role of like this, talking about Gaza being taboo and how it connects to like Holocaust memory and Jewish like historical persecution. And I think that, I think at the core of the question is one of the core tragedies of the last 75 years, which is that the Holocaust and the horrors of the Holocaust were used by some to create to implement the political ideology of Zionism that led to the systematic ethnic cleansing and displacement of Palestinians in order to create an ethno-nationalist state. And that's tragic. Like it really is tragic. I'm like getting emotional about it. It's really a tragedy, because wouldn't it be beautiful if we could be building toward a future where instead people have historically been persecuted are banding together and creating a better future, rather than pitting one another against each other and being pitted against each other. And I think that, I am a very proudly anti-Zionist Jewish person, and I am part of a rapidly growing and developing anti-Zionist Jewish community. And that's what we're trying to do, is build that future by being in solidarity with and accountability to following the Palestinian-led Palestinian liberation movement to create a future in which all people, no exceptions, are living in freedom and in liberation, and in which these histories, these traumas are not being reenacted in these horrible ways over and over again to perpetuate these cycles of oppression and horror time and time again. And for right now, in this current moment, I think that this tragedy, the ways that this trauma has been so systematically weaponized in these horrible ways, and often by some of the biggest American legacy Jewish institutions and by the Israeli government itself, is that we are seeing a moment where the memory of the genocide of Jewish people in Europe is being weaponized to deny that there is an ongoing genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. And again, I think that sometimes we're in the moment of kind of like in the political conversation in the US where it just kind of gets like talking pointy and like, but again, that's a tragedy. That's a horrible thing that's what's happening right now. And in particular, around the ICJ case that Diala was describing, it really came to a head where there were people like, Alan Dershowitz and all these just miserable, horrible people who are like, how dare South Africa accuse the Jews of Israel of violating the Genocide Convention when the Genocide Convention only exists because of what happened to us. And it's like, exactly, that's exactly it, man. Like, this came out of the Holocaust. Jews should be at the forefront of fighting against this, not at the forefront of denying it. And the other thing that I think happens is that there is also the idea that there is like a monolithic Jewish opinion, which like, obviously there's not. That's not true for any community. It's certainly not true for the Jewish community. And when you marry that with the ways in which there is this conflation between Israel and Jews, we spiral out to where we are now, right? where the idea that like, oh, you're accusing Jews of committing genocide. It's like, okay, well, we're accusing the Israeli government of committing genocide. They are Jewish. It doesn't mean we're saying like this other, you're saying that we're saying something else, right? Like it gets spun in these horrible ways that weaponize anti-Semitism, that weaponize Holocaust memory and trauma into these horrible places where now, as for the last 75 plus years, this is all being borne out by horrific genocidal systematic violence against Palestinians who are being displaced from their land. And so it really is just a horror and a tragedy, the way that this is all being weaponized and utilized in this horrible way. And it connects directly, I think, to the question about this narrative that like the New York Times and everyone loves to say, which is like the progressive community has abandoned Jews. Okay, like Jews make up a pretty big, we're part of the progressive community. First of all, it's not a, like one or the other. It's not an either or in that way. And also, again, it's a conflation here. There's a conflation happening between the idea that like, because progressives are speaking out for progressive values and criticizing the Israeli state, criticizing Zionism, criticizing the Israeli government, that somehow means that like Jews as a whole have been abandoned is again rooted in a false conflation between Jewish people and the Israeli state and the Israeli government that is simply not true. And I think that it's really important that we be clear about the differences between those things. And again, I'll just end by saying nothing can be painted with a broad brush in that way. Like I am part of a Jewish community that is actively seeking to hold the Israeli government accountable for its actions and end what is happening. So like that alone shows that is not true, right? Like there's a diversity of opinions with any given community. And I think that the media really likes to grab onto a juicy who's been abandoned by who story and really run with it. But again, the most important thing in all of this, I really think, is that we hold on to the fact that what all of this mess means is that there are excuses being given for an unfolding, currently happening in this exact moment, genocide against 2.3 million people who are trapped in Gaza with bombs being funded by our government raining down on them. And I think it's important that we keep that centered and that urgency in mind as we talk about the tragedy of what has kind of been a part of all of this as well.
Thank you, Beth. I think we have one more question, but I actually just want to add something briefly to what Beth was saying, which is all of this is also weaponized and used to make it so that people feel like they can't speak out about what's happening unless they're Jewish, unless they're Israeli, unless they're Palestinian, unless they're Arab, unless they're Muslim. When in fact, it's like actually every single person, regardless of your identity, should be at the front lines of organizing against a genocide, and that no one has more of a right to speak about this because of their identity. And that I think we really have to assert that, especially in like workplaces and college campuses, our children's daycares, whatever it is, that you should be speaking out. You have a responsibility to be speaking out just because you're you, just because you're a human, and not because of any identity you're connected to that gives you the right to speak out or makes things less complicated or anything like that. We have one more question. I know we're almost at time.
Yeah, just to add from the Zoom, how can we make AIPAC money toxic in the upcoming election cycle? And someone else that compared it to the successful effort to make real estate donation toxic for progressive candidates.
Okay, for this last question, I also want to invite the panelists who don't want to necessarily answer that to also just give closing remarks. So you can answer the question and give closing remarks, or just do closing remarks. And maybe we'll start. Sandra?
Well, I have a very easy answer for that question. Make sure Cori Bush wins her election. I think this is going to be the test for a lot. I have a bias. I'm here in St. Louis, but she's really she's staking her whole election on Palestine and her connection to Palestine built 10 years ago in Ferguson. So I really think this is a test for our movement. I'm not supposed to be saying this, but this is me, Sandra, not my organization that's telling you to do all you can to support Cori Bush's election. And yes, thank you to the organizers. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you. This was really a great conversation. And, I think our union also just passed a resolution. And I think the labor battles are like really, really crucial. And one of the things that we're seeing, and I should just mention since I'm in this space, is we've been talking about, I think, all the right things, but one of the things that's sort of another elephant in the room is all of the repression in this moment and like the attacks that come for speaking out on Palestine. And I think really just to the movement's credit, the level of repression is really severe and unprecedented, and it's kind of amazing to see how people have not stopped. Whatever it is that they're doing, pushing their unions, pushing, organizing on their campuses, protesting, shutting everything down. Like, it's really a moment that is, I think, unlike anything that I have ever lived through. And so that gives me some cause for hope. Although, of course, we're nowhere near enough, but it is really, so it's super important to be thinking about all of those spaces, and also being mindful that as we try to do all this proactive stuff, there's just like a really robust campaign to try to shut everyone down and to not kind of give in to it. So thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, let's make AIPAC money toxic to progressives. I think I'm going to maybe take that question too which is just, I think what Sandra said is key. Defend Cori Bush and defend people like Cori Bush, right? Like, I think that this is a proof of concept cycle for AIPAC, right? Where they're trying to show that like their theory of change works, which is that if you speak out for Palestine, we'll flood your race with money and you'll lose. And we need to show that that's not true and create a different situation. But also, I think it's important for us to remember that like most people in the US don't know AIPAC. Like, if you ask most people about AIPAC, they're like, who? I don't know what that is. I don't know what you're talking about. And so there's like a lot of like political education that needs to happen, not just about AIPAC, but about in general, like the political world around us and the way that this issue is being treated, is the way that this issue plays out in our politics, basically, and the ways that our values get kind of erased in these ways and voters get not heard. And so I think that joining DSA is a great way to get involved and plug into that. JVP Action as well, and probably many other movement groups that you're involved in are like diving into that work in the upcoming cycle to try to like expose what AIPAC is doing. And I think that one thing that's really good for us to do when we talk about AIPAC is to find ways to link the core of like AIPAC's stated mission and mandate, which is upholding and continuing and deepening the US government's relationship to the Israeli government. Like, that is what their stated mission is. Syncing that up to things that people who maybe don't yet care about Palestine do care about, which is like the state of democracy in the United States, or the fact that AIPAC endorsed over 100 insurrectionists, or the fact that they are flooding races with money because of the Citizens United ruling and what it's allowed their super PAC to do. There's like other ways that we can bring people in if they don't yet care about this issue, and then make that an on-ramp to also caring about Palestine and showing them that all these things are connected. So I think that's one of the key things we can do to reach more people. And then I'll just say that I'm very honored and grateful to have been a part of this brilliant panel with these brilliant people, and thank you all so
much. Let's just do one more round of applause. Thank you so much for our speakers tonight. This is a conversation in the midst of an intense movement moment we've been living through, a moment where we're struggling for justice under the most terrible circumstances, and people are suffering horribly. I hope we all find in it some, thinking and strength and moral courage to keep doing the movement. I love what Diala said, they're trying hard to shut us down. We will not let that happen. We have to stand up for what's right. a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, just out of curiosity, who's their first DSA event is tonight? Oh, I love that. So please get involved. What Sumaya said earlier about just like get involved, sign up. We have actions coming up, socialists.nyc/Gaza. Phone banks, Congress is probably going to try to send a ton of money to Israel this week. It's our job to be flooding the lines, to get our neighbors, to get our friends, to get our coworkers, everyone just screaming out, we're not going to let this happen. Go to the JVP Action tool, go to the DSA tool, go to the AJP tool. Also, please support all the organizations you've heard about tonight. Join DSA, get involved. You know, it's on us to do exactly what Sandra said, to make it today, tomorrow, 3 weeks, 5 years from now, a whole different politics in America around Zionism in Israel. That's our job and the job of everyone here in this room. So get involved, get organized. Finally, very last is just please stack your chairs kind of right away so people aren't falling over each other. I love a full house. One more round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra and